And maybe I don't really have to memorize all the information about the grapes or the land, but I get that introduction story to, oh, this is the vibe of the place. And then you can build on that.
I'm Wendy Holloway, and this is Flavor of Italy, sharing the very best of Italian food and wine, lifestyle, and culture. This is Wendy Holloway with Flavor of Italy, and I'm here today with Kate Leahy to talk about a book, one of the many books she's written, Italian Wine, the History, Regions, and Grapes of an Iconic Wine Country. And here's what it looks like. It's a great book. I want to say a few things before we start. In doing some background reading on you, Kate, I came across some stuff. One is some months back, you shared on Instagram of your very first and best rejection letter you ever received, which I love. And it was from Clarkson Potter. Now, we're talking about 1989. I don't know your age. I have the feeling that you were probably like 10 or 12 years old at the time. And it was an illustrated book about a girl looking for a missing moose. And then you went to the library, you found the name of the publisher of a favorite book of yours, wrote them, typed it out because 1989, what was there?
It was definitely a typewriter.
There was a typewriter. And you wrote them a pretty insistent letter, assuming that they were going to publish it. But it didn't get published. I think you should go back but it speaks to the way you are. Also, it says to me that you're meant to be writing books, working on books, which you are now. And then in an interview with Substack writer Jenna Helwig, who I love, she asked you, what are you most proud of when it comes to wine style, which is another wine book that you've written that has a lot of, I would say, pretty American focused recipes, but it has some wonderful essential information on wine. And your reply was, I tried to take out a lot of the wine speak in the wine descriptions, which was challenging because most books I'd used for reference lean towards jargon. And that is so true. And I think a lot of people who are interested in wine get a little bit left in the weeds because of it. And one of the things that you said about tannins, which is one of the big words in wine, is, have you ever brewed black tea and then forgotten to take the tea leaves out? The way that drinking overbrewed tea can dry out the surface of your tongue is the effect of tannins. They make your mouth water and your tongue tighten. And so that your tannin text and wording was one of the many instances in that book where you found the right way to explain this in ways that if I had a very tannin-rich wine and my grandson said, Grandma, what's it like in your mouth? I could say your tea explanation, not that he's drinking a lot of tea,
Right.
but it really says it. A lot of people, they go to a wine tasting and they talk about it tastes like tar. What does that really mean? What if you live in a place where you don't have a paved road from tar, or many of the other descriptors? So your book was wonderful. And so it promised well for your following book of Italian wine, which is more of, I would say, a tome sort of a thing, and grouped it region by region alphabetically, and then some just sort of generic background information, history, the land and wines, the provinces, the region's grapes, the regional foods, and recommended producers. So it goes through in a very orderly fashion. which is great. Now, the number of wines in Italy are far greater than what your book covers, but it's a great book for someone who wants to have something about Italian wine. I haven't let you say a single word yet, but you had mentioned to me that not a lot of people bought the hard copy of the book, that they got it.
Oh, no, they did. They did. Yeah, the hard copy is selling well, but the nice thing about having a book with no recipes is that few cookbooks have audiobook components. This book has no recipes. Italian Wine, the book has no recipes, but it doesn't have an audio component. So somebody wouldn't necessarily have to carry a hardcover book to Italy. They could download the audiobook, and if they're traveling through Umbria, they could listen to that chapter.
Okay. Now, where did this? I know you co authored it with Shelley, whom you've done a number of books with. She's a wonderful sommelier, expert on Italian wine. But where did the idea come from? The two of you did it together. Was it from Shelley or?
I'll tell you, it was a long winding road to get to this book. Shelley and I, our first book that we worked on together was the cookbook A16, which is based on her restaurant in San Francisco called A16, which is the name of the autostrada that runs from Naples to into Puglia. And I'm sure you've driven on the highway,
I
the
saw that
autostrada.
that was like the first book that you had co-authored, and I'm like,
Right.
that's a weird name for a book.
Title
It's what it,
Absolutely, from coming from someone living in Italy, it would be like calling a book about California, like the 101 or something, the 405,
yeah.
so
So it was
right,
only in reading about that region, and you mentioned that that's where the title of the book came from, because it featured Southern Italian wines on the wine list of the restaurant. But
right.
otherwise, I was confused by that.
So Shelley and I worked on that book. We worked on the wine section together, and I also worked with the chef of the restaurant at the time, Nate Appleman, and that was the recipe component of that cookbook. So it was one part wine, one part Southern Italian cooking. And the book came out in a time where in the US, there wasn't a lot of cookbooks being published about regional specific Italian food. It was still in that greatest hits era where you had to have you had to have a risotto, you had to have a pappardelle. It didn't matter like what the restaurant was, it was the greatest hits era. And that was changing at that time. But A16, the restaurant, capitalized on that. But what made it extra unique was Shelley was a sommelier, and she really has always sought out underappreciated wines. And back in 2004, when the restaurant opened, nobody in San Francisco knew much about Southern Italian wines. There were the wine experts did, but the average people going in wanting a glass of wine, they were either going to look at Napa or they were looking at the famous names that they already recognized from France and Italy. But they weren't, say, looking for an Aglianico from Campania per se. And Shelley thought, well, I had amazing wines while we were researching the food and wine of that region before we opened the restaurant. Why aren't we pouring these wines? So she's calling up these wine reps. They've got dusty bottles, and they said, yeah, we can offload these. So it was, if I could go back and drink the wines Shelley was pouring in 2004 at that price point, oh my gosh, it was just a different world.
Is that
And
restaurant
now,
still around?
yes, it's still around. They also have a restaurant now in Oakland, and they're opening up a restaurant that's not called A16. It's going to be called after, it'll be something focused on Basilicata and sort of Calabria, and it'll be a breakfast, lunch, dinner place that has that sort of all day Italian,
In the
Southern
city.
Italian.
In
It'll be in the city at the Ferry Building. I think it's opening
Oh,
up
oh, in the
in
Ferry Building. Oh, nice.
2026. Yeah, yeah. So long story short, or long story longer, years go by. Shelley's been wanting to write a Southern Italian wine book. And it must have been 5, 6, 7 years after A16 came out. We said, okay, let's pitch it to our publisher, 10 Speed Press, who did A16. And they thought, it's too niche. If you're going to do an Italian wine book, it has to be all of Italy. And I went back to Shelley. I said, "Are you nuts? That's a lot of wine information."
Yeah.
Each region could, well, as you know, Wendy, each region could be its own book about wine. So
Well, yeah, you cite and you've been in touch with Ian D'Agata, and he writes these wine books one after another, and they're tomes, they're huge. And so it was kind of the publisher driven decision that it has to be all or nothing, not just one region.
exactly.
Yeah, and that makes
Right.
sense, actually.
It does. Looking back, it does make a lot of sense because you're still talking about the primary audience for this book is North America. And for to explain to people who haven't traveled extensively to Italy that there are all these different regions, all of them have their different wine traditions. I could see someone picking up a book and say, "Well, where's Piedmont? Why isn't it in this book?" It's like, "Oh, because it's not in the southern part of Italy." You're assuming a lot that people know exactly which region is where.
So then you say it's for North American readers primarily. But
I think so. Yeah.
so many of these wines are not easy to find in the United States.
Wine in the United States, it's so complicated because of each state having different laws on where they who can have the who can import wine, who has the wine licensing. So I think the biggest markets for Italian wine in the US are probably New York, California, and Illinois, specifically Chicago. I think those are huge. There are other cities that have big Italian wine consumers. I know there's a lot going on in Texas, but I do think it can be hard to find wines if you're living in a state where you have to buy your wine at a state controlled liquor store, right? However, there are certain Italian wines that I feel most people can find if they're looking. Like I love Montepulciano di Abruzzo. I think it's usually a really attractive price point for the quality. And if you look for certain names, maybe in our book or in other online resources, you can find such amazing wines. I feel like Abruzzo just doesn't get the credit for having such a great wine culture because for so long they were where a lot of cheap, as they call them, like the cheap and cheerful reds came from.
So, still, if the target market's North America and there are certain states where these wines are more accessible, and I'm just thinking, for example, there are some wines I really love over here, and I think, okay, I'm going to get them through some online vendor and have it sent to my sister's house in San Francisco. And they just don't have them. And I try another online sales outlet and they don't have them. So I'm wondering if some people might see the book and say, I love this. I love reading the history and everything, but I'm not going to be able to get these wines. I don't remember if you had in your index a list of online sales.
It's really hard to have that for and have it go for an entire country. We thought about that. But we do talk about if you're looking for Italian wines and you have a bottle that you found at a store and you like it, just look at the label and see who the importer is. And then you can look at that importer's website. And not all importers import to all states, but an importer, I feel, to use a publishing analogy, if you pick up a book and you look at the spine and you'll see the little logo from that publishing house. If you're not a publishing insider, you don't really notice that Clarkson Potter is the publisher of that cookbook. If you do know publishing, you'll think, oh, that's a Clarkson Potter book. And if you're inside, oh, I wonder what else Clarkson Potter is publishing this year. It's kind of the same with wine. Say, if you really like a certain wine, you look at the label and go, oh, Oliver McCrum, I'm going to start looking at other wines that that importer carries. And if they're in the store that I'm living in currently, I can find other bottles that that importer is maybe potentially selling into the store as well.
Yeah, that
It's
makes
complicated
sense.
though.
If you're US based and you run across a bottle, then you're going to necessarily see who the importer is. But from over here, thinking, oh, I
You would
have
know.
this wine there, it doesn't necessarily coincide.
Right.
Yeah. So, what did you want to actually accomplish with this book? Was it to let people know about like where they can get these wines or the history, or what was?
I think with this book, the purpose was giving people a path into Italian wine who might only drink French wine or only drink wines that they've had before, and they don't get into Italian wines because it seems too complicated. And this is a really simple story, but a lot of Italian wine books are organized geographically. They start in the north and they end in the south or maybe the islands. And I started thinking, why not do it alphabetically? Because maybe I've heard of Umbria, but I might not know it's exactly in the center of Italy. And where is that going to fall in a book that's organized
Yeah.
regionally? So if it's organized alphabetically, I can flip to the region that I'm interested in and read about it. And maybe I don't really have to memorize all the information about the grapes or the land, but I get that introduction story to, oh, this is the vibe of the place. And then you can build on that. It's just giving people an entryway to build, to get enough stories and interests that then they can add to their understanding of a place. And that was the idea. It's like if you got a bottle of wine from Tuscany and you looked at the label and you said, "Oh, I'm going to read a little bit about Tuscany and see what else I can learn about that." It just adds to maybe that person's understanding or appreciation of that bottle.
Yeah. And the book did well in the hard copy, or is doing well?
Yes, yeah. So I'm sorry I confused. It's more that not all the sales come from the hard copy, but it is doing well in hard copy. Yeah.
Okay. Because I would think it's really meant to be hard copy because it is a reference book too. You want to go back, and if you decide you're going to be in Abruzzo or you're looking at a map, there are just lots of interest points where you would want to go to the book and consult. And also, I don't know if you actually went to see them, but I'm always discovering new wines in Italy constantly. And one producer I've just twice at two meals in the past month is Eleanor Walsh.
Oh, yes. Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah, and I'm going to interview one of the, because it's
Oh,
an
great.
all women owned and operated winery. So it's the mom and the two daughters. I'm going to be interviewing one of the daughters. So
Wonderful.
yeah, in two different restaurants that was kind of put before me as a try this, try that. And I thought, oh, this is getting more and more interesting.
Can I ask you, Wendy, what wines are you drinking and how do you find wine in where you live in Rome?
Okay, we do not open a bottle every
Of course.
day by any means. So it's usually I'll go to someone's house or I go to a restaurant, our favorite restaurant. If you ever come to Rome, I'll have to take you there. But they always say, you try this one, you're going to like it. And then, so it's a lot of time restaurants, or I might have done, let's say, a podcast episode on a certain place, and I want to dig a little more into that region.
I
So,
see. Now in Rome, have you noticed it change from a lot of like what people in your area want to drink, the Italians, what they want to drink? Has that changed? Have they gone from wanting to drink Lazio wines and regional wines to all of Italian wines, or has it always been a place where Romans want to drink all of Italy?
well, I actually live in a little town just north of Rome. So I can see St. Peter's Dome from our property, small, but I can. But if I go have something to eat at the home of someone local,
Mhm.
they have probably made their own wine, which I would prefer not to drink. And
With the local grapes and yeah.
yeah, yeah. But international friends, I love rosé.
Mm.
One of our good friends, he actually lives in California now, but he grew up here and everything. He's big on rosé and French rosé. So when I'm with him and that little group of people, we might gravitate towards that. And a friend of mine who has written a wine book on rosé. So I do tend to look for rosés, which interests me a lot. And I see you had a tiny little bit written about rosés, but not so much. And there are so many wonderful rosé wines in Italy.
Oh, sure. Cerasuolo is one of my favorites from Abruzzo, and I think in the different grape sections, they'll talk about if, for example, Galliopo, they make wonderful rosés or rosatos in Calabria with Galliopo, and of course, Puglia, they don't have a big white wine
Oh,
tradition,
they're
so you're
big
better
on
off.
rosé, yeah.
Exactly, yeah, and it's a perfect climate for rosé. I think rosé is one of the most food-friendly wines there is for sure.
Yeah. And one thing Italy does well is it's not just a summer wine, it's something that you would drink year round. You mentioned, I guess, when you were writing this book, talking about climate change wasn't as big of a thing as it is now. And some of the other interesting things people are doing with wine, like unfiltered wines and so forth. What do you see changing with Italian wines?
Right.
It,
I
yeah,
think one big thing is you see this in I think one of the most clear-cut places that climate change is really affecting wine is in Piedmont. So Piedmont is one of the most famous wine regions internationally. And for years, all the attention was on the Langhe. Like everybody wanted to go to Barolo, Barbaresco, and the areas around there. And I think one of the interesting situations now is Alto Piemonte is having a moment. This was a region that was the region in Piemonte a century ago. And slowly, as the forces of economics changed over time and people left the vineyards and went to work in the factories, these vineyards just became overgrown. They became covered with forests. And then there was a whole generation of people who never learned how to work the land because they had the family property, but they didn't make wine anymore. And there's this new generation coming in salvaging these old vines, taking out some of the forest and the climate there now, which maybe wasn't as desirable 100 years ago, is a really great place for their local Nebbiolo to really shine. So I feel like in Alto Piemonte, maybe climate change is benefiting them, but in Barolo and Barbaresco, they're having to change the way they think about farming. Maybe those south-facing slopes, which were all the rage when it was hard to get grapes to ripen, now maybe it's getting a little too hot. And maybe different types of slopes that don't get as much sunlight are more beneficial. So we're seeing those shifts. But winemakers are just getting very clever too about maybe we need to leave more foliage to shade the grapes. Maybe we don't need to trim it back as dramatically as we did in, say, the early 2000s when ripeness was like the only thing that mattered.
yeah. And PIWI wines is one of the things you touched on in an earlier chapter.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an interesting thing, too. I do think places that are experimenting with different rootstocks and hybrids, and that's, I think, mostly happening in, say, Alto Adige or that part of Italy. We'll see. I think no matter what makes Italy so important for the world of wine is the grape biodiversity that's there.
Yeah.
And there are grapes that we probably haven't discovered yet that are probably perfect to withstand whatever's happening in Napa right now with hot temperatures. And at least it's kind of like this pool of biodiversity that hopefully can keep grapes, like if an area is not growing so well with a certain variety, there's probably a variety in Italy somewhere that might thrive there.
Yeah, I did a whole podcast episode and organized a wine tasting around the PIWI wines, which at first
Oh,
I tend to feel instinctively very protective and traditional. No, let's stick. But then you think climate change is here, and are you going to constantly use pesticides, and let's find some other way and build up another, using what we have, something really flavorful and maybe a little unique.
Sure.
So you went around with, and you traveled throughout Italy to do this book. You were in touch with producers and stuff a distanza, long distance, but you went around. What was the most interesting thing you encountered on your travels to do this book?
I probably would change depending on what day it was because there were so many interesting things. And I think you living there know this, but I think a lot of Americans don't get to experience these off the beaten track places in Italy that are so immensely interesting and or beautiful. And that was probably the most eye-opening part of traveling there, and not doing the tourist thing, but going in and having real meetings with people and going into homes. There was and I have to say too that the book we we traveled for the A16 book back in 2006. We traveled again in 2012. Shelley kept going back every year. And then we did a big trip in 2019. We were supposed to have this book done in 2020, but that did not happen for reasons I think everyone can figure out.
Yeah.
So then after that, it was like, oh my gosh, if I didn't have all those notes, I don't know what I would have done. But because there's only so much you can kind of understand from a distance. But to answer your question about the most interesting place, oof, I don't know. I will say Cristiana Tiberio, who's the producer of Tiberio Wines in Abruzzo, she hosted
And
us
you have
and
a
we
picture of her in the book
yes,
with her dog.
yes,
Yeah.
with her dog, and she just was so passionate about Abruzzo and took us. We were in the mountains, and then we were in the sea, just like it's that whole distance between the mountains and the sea is so close together. And then she just took us to this little abandoned hill town in Abruzzo, not too far from her winery, and we just wandered around, and it was kind of like it's that story of these towns that were hollowed out, and some are getting rehabitated, some are not. And it was this just reminder of how I think like tenuous some of these traditions can be if there's nobody there to perpetuate them.
Thank you so much, Kate. This has been great. And if you're listening and you're interested in Italian wine, get the hard copy. Thanks. This has been Flavor of Italy. Find us on www.flavorofitaly.com and on Substack, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Facebook, always as Flavor of Italy.